Well, now, Your Excellencies, ladies, gentlemen, dear friends and colleagues, it is for me a very great honor to chair this session with a number of prominent, eminent, and highly sophisticated members of the panel, which I will have the honor to present to you later on. We are in the context of our diplomacy for the 21st century, looking towards a continent that is very far away from us, but with which we have ties, important ties, and which has shared with us a number of circumstances in the past, of historical events, and that makes it imperative for us to know what they are doing. How did they come to their present democratic processes? Latin America is far away, but we have been striving to have relations in commerce, in politics, and now we must also look in the inside of these countries and see how we can take advantage of their experiences, of what they went through to reach a certain stability in most of these countries. We have a panel of a number of very prominent personalities, and I think that we will all, we shouldn't wait more before asking them to give us their views, their experience of what their countries went through, so we will take advantage of their experience. First, I will ask His Excellency President Luis Alberto Lacalle, who was the president of Uruguay from 1990 to 1995. He was a lawyer, and he is a man with a great sense of humor. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
It's good to have some sense of humor if you want to become a president. Thank you, dear friends. First, some other facts on my long political life. I have been involved in politics since I was 17, and I'm 74 now. I belong to a party that next year will be 180 years old, one of the oldest in the world. And I come from Uruguay, a very small country with a population of a neighborhood of Alexandria, 3.5 million. So let me tell you something about Latin America, which I always have to tell. From my point of view, there is not one single Latin America. There are at least four, if you take into account some data from reality. People tend to put us all in a bag to make the speech and description more easy, but I do tell you that from Mexico and the Caribbean to the River Plate, there is a difference. From the Pacific to the Atlantic, some of these differences come from a not very well remembered fact. The independence of Hispanoamerica, as we call it, or Iberoamerica, has two causes or two different histories. All the former Spanish colonies were declaring their independence since 1810, more or less, up to 1898. Cuba was the last. And mainly, these independence were obtained through struggle and conflict. Instead of that, Brazil, the other half or the other big part of Latin America, was so only a succession of mutual concessions between King John VI of Portugal and Dom Pedro I, Peter I of Brazil. when the Napoleonic Wars ended, the King of Portugal had the idea of coming to America, to his possessions, went back to his country, and his son just stayed there. There wasn't a battle, there wasn't a struggle, there wasn't any crisis. Just Don Pedro I, Don Peter I said, I stay, eu fico. That was the independence of Brazil. What I want to tell you about those no birth pains. Brazil was just seceding from the mother country that was Portugal. Instead, in our Hispanic part of the colony, we had battles, struggles, fight against the Spaniards, which made our independence much more bloody and born out of conflict. And on the other hand, the Hispanic colonies took from the French Revolution the worst part of the revolution, which was Jacobinism. So, in many countries today, and I won't name them, Jacobinism, that means not giving a reason to the other and killing each other, is still in our ADN. All these countries were independent, had their constitution, and began this long and troubled history of Latin America. All of them went for the formal part of democracy, having a constitution, having a parliament, which was only a progress in writing, in laws, in paper, not in reality, because the rights were never exercised completely, and the rule of law was never completely in full accomplished fully. Some of the countries, more or less like mine, organized themselves around the vote, the legitimacy of the governments, and as I'm telling you, my country, since 1904, never had a revolution, never had another civil war. That's not the rule in the continent. But nowadays, in these last 15, 20 years, another kind of governments cropped up. They are called populist governments, and they have one characteristic of the democracies, which is legitimacy of origin. They were voted upon. In Venezuela, in Ecuador, for instance, both governments have an origin of legitimacy of origin. But to have a complete democracy, you need the other legitimacy, which is the legitimacy of exercise of the government. That means the rule of law. That's why this new so-called half democracies are now standing in Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, more or less in Argentina. Why are we putting a special emphasis on this new kind of democracies? Because this populist exercise we are seeing in our countries have done a lot of damage to the system and to the good name of the continent. This populist disease of democracy has a typical formula. First, you need money. All of them were built on the windfall or either petroleum or the commodities that we sell. Second, they begin by describing themselves, these regimes, as founding regimes. The new man, the concept from Marxism of the new man, the beginning of history. Nothing that happened before them is valuable. They are beginning. They are in point 1 or 0 of the history. They resent the media. They say, of course, freedom of the media is one thing, but this is too much. We must approve some rules on the conduct of the media, which they do. They have absolute majority in the parliaments. They claim to be the real democracy because of the direct democracy they are proclaiming as the real thing. And in the past, the real participatory democracy, direct democracy, was exercised from a balcony, like in Italy, in Piazza Venezia, and the people were roaring their approval after the speech of the leaders. Now they do it in television with 2, 3, 4, 5 hours of speeches, and the balcony is television, but they assume that they have the approval of the people. All these kind of characteristics, they put them into a bag and approve a new constitution, normally allowing the executive power to be re-elected 2, 3, 4, or forever times, as it's been happening now in Ecuador. So you see that the old defects were changing to new defects. In the past, there were, in some countries, an alliance between the oligarchy and the military. Sometimes the military took care of government directly. Now, for the first time, we have military with leftist ideas and all these characteristics that, sadly enough, are too common nowadays. One thing that Dr. Ismail was telling us this morning about the lack of interest or participation in politics, even where there are democratic methods to participate, is one of the big illnesses and one of the conditions of this kind of pseudo-democracies to prosper. And I do think that the figures that were given by Dr. Ismail are very alarming, because when you have countries as Colombia, when you have countries as Costa Rica, you have countries as Panama, you have countries in Chile, in which people are not taking advantage of the system to participate, there you have the real profound illness of the system. And this lack of participation, this auto-exclusion of people in the moment of selecting their governments, has two faces. One, which is very, very perverse, is that people, common people, the people, having the instrument to change the government, don't participate. Disillusion, knowing that they're all the same, there are lots of explanations. But the other exclusion, which is much more important from my point of view, is that the elites that have money or have better education, or academics, or famous writers, exclude themselves from the duties of being whom they are. Remember that in the gospel we have the parabola de los talentos. You are responsible for what you have in society, and you have more duties than others because you have either more money or more prestige or much more cultivated. And I think that is one of the main problems. With all due respect, and knowing it very well, I appeal to the case of Argentina. In Argentina, after 1930, that was the first of the coups against elected governments, all the people that are wealthy, and there are a lot of wealthy people, well-educated, with the best access to culture, sort of said, I'm over politics. I have nothing to do with this exclusion, auto-exclusion that after that brought all we know about Peronismo and so on. So I think that the real crisis, perhaps when you look very superficially to the situation, you say, well, this populist, Chavez and Correa and the other one. But in the really deep reasons, I think that is the up to exclusion of people from the public service. And public service is a duty. In my country, still, we have the pride of belonging to the government, going to serve in government and being elected as members of parliament. In my family, my son is the fifth generation of politics and of politicians, and we feel very proud of that, and there are lots of people that give their time either permanently or are very proud to serve in a ministry and then go back to their own lawyers' offices or whatever they have. The other phases of this crisis, I think, is to be found that in the fact that power in modern society has many centers. Of course, there's traditional political center, economic power, the unions, the media. Now we have the networks. And sometimes, and I say again with all due respect, the confusion between the unions and the NGOs, putting them in the same level of responsibility as the political parties, it's very bad for democracy. Why? Because political parties are not better than the NGOs or the unions. It's just that because of the Constitution, political parties arrive to power or to the opposition, but there they exercise public power, which means the possibility of approving rules that others must abide for. The NGOs sometimes is very good people, 3, 4, 25, with money and the access of the media, and they are challenging the representative legitimacy of the parties. And the unions, that's the case of my country, nowadays they are eye to eye with the party in power, and they become members of parliament and then back to the unions in a mixture that's not good for democracy, being unions very necessary and very important to the development of well-organized society. So as you see, Latin America is not one, not only one. The problems we have are some of organization, some of ideology, but sometimes for the lack of responsibility in participating. And just to summarize my ideas, I think that the basic conditions is to return, because almost all the countries have had a past of effective democracy, is to go back to, first, representative democracy. There is no direct democracy or the possibility of exercising it. In my country, for instance, we have only two possibilities. One is the plebiscite upon the new constitution, if you have one, and the second is the referendum against the laws. But then it's representative. The complexity of political and governmental problems needs representativeness. It cannot be done directly. Then, no re-election. I think that one of the poisons of democracy is re-election. Only 5, only 4, only 6, you have your term very well limited, and then you can do what you can, what you know how to, or what you want. But you know that the last day is the last day. I will tell you about my last day because it's very funny and exemplary. As president, you're not allowed to drive. You have a chauffeur, because if there is an accident, it's not the president that rolled over a bicycle, but it's the chauffeur. No? saves you from responsibility. And for the first time, I took my truck, my Toyota truck, which is my car, and went driving in one of the main avenues of Montevideo. And when people recognized me, they had a wry smile saying, oh, up to yesterday you had the motorcycles, you had whatever, and now you are stopping in the red light. And I said, that's the real force of my country. Because nowadays, the four former presidents, we go around the city, we go to the supermarket with soccer matches, without bodyguards, without nothing, driving our own cars. And that's because there's no re-election. The last day is the last day. And then one other thing is the open selection of candidates in the parties. Because you can have a party system, as we have this very old one, 180 years, but if you select the candidates in your kitchen or your living room with the others, now we have open primaries, so the path is open up to the top. You want to participate and to get elected as a candidate, you have the primaries, open primaries. And then you must win the elections. And the last thing, public funding of elections. I am now fighting to eliminate the possibility of private money in the electoral system. My son ran for president last year. He's 42, and he spent, and the others more or less, $5 million in an electorate of 2.4 million. It's obscene that 1, 2, 3 parties, 3 times 6, 18 millions in that small country. And now I'm fighting and having a bit of an echo for only public funding and only the use of the state television. That will take 80% of the money out of politics, and that will be a very, very good thing to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think we all have to take lessons from your presentation, from your experience, and your advice about money in politics. I think we need that in our part of the world, and we're certainly happy to hear that you have managed to present these ideas and this proposal. If I may now, I will turn to our second speaker, Her Excellency President Rosalia Arega Serrano. She was President of Ecuador after having been a journalist, an educator, a lawyer, and worked in the development field. And after a long career in many posts, she is now leading a foundation called FIDAL, who works actively in education. President Serrano, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I want to say thank you to Mr. Dr. Ismael Serechaldin for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here at the very symbolic Library of Alexandria. My first time in Alexandria, my first time in Egypt. And I'm really happy to share with all of you some thoughts about democracy. As my colleague from Uruguay, Luis Alberto Lacalle, says, we are not only one Latin America, we are many, maybe more than 4. And I will speak more thinking about the Andean Amazonic countries, especially the Andean countries where I am from. And I think that it's remarkable that through our voices from Luis Alberto and the colleague from Mexico, we are representing here in this forum the Latin America thoughts and trying to establish some parameters for the consolidation of democracy in the 21st century, when once again there are winds of war blowing around the world. As Luis Alberto says, America has always been seen as the new continent, and in multiple occasions, it has been thought that Latin America, particularly, is the continent of hope. I don't know if in this latitude talk a lot about Latin America, but usually in Europe and in other continents, when we talk about Latin America, we say that it's a continent of hope. On our end, we wish this appreciation to be transformed from a purely theoretical statement to a practice benefiting their own citizens and the world. After the independence process, as Luis Alberto says, the diverse countries in which Latin America was fragmented, once considerably bigger than others, went their own way, trying to leave a footprint in several times battling with their neighbors when defining the borders. We had a lot of some small wars, some bigger wars between the countries, losing people and resources in these combats that in some of the cases lasted until the dawning of this century. We, particularly Ecuador and Peru, signed the peace at the end of the last century, starting this century. And it cost a lot of lives and resources. During the process of the creation of the republics by the ex-colonies, many nations had ruled dictatorial government headed by former caudillos. It was some very famous generals trying to catch the different countries. There were some agreements between them sometimes. However, little by little, these processes were refined, honing electoral systems, aiming to incorporate what is stated in their constitutions or fundamental laws. These processes decanted in governments which emerged from the popular will, governments that in some cases honored their democratic origin, but in others made way to new dictatorships. Sometimes the origin was an electoral origin, but in the process, they develop in dictators. Thus, after some hurtful situations in which countries' dictatorships, especially those, the so-called Southern Cone, which gave way to death and disappearance. I'm talking about some of our countries like Argentina, even Brazil, and Paraguay and others. They have terrible dictatorships, and people has to run away the countries, and a lot of people died. And there are still some processes trying to discover how many people died during this period. Since the 70s and 80s of the last century, new democratic governments started again to consolidate, seeking to construct or reconstruct, depending on the case, their democratic institutionalism. The democratic institutions are still fragile in Latin American countries. The recent history of several of them, among those my country, Ecuador, shows that the authoritarian regimes that we believed were eradicated merged again with the eagerness of the leaders of countries like Venezuela, Bolivia, Nicaragua, Ecuador, and I hope until recently, Argentina. Some things are last weeks to change in Argentina. These leaders merged with the desire of perpetuating in power, of leaving aside fundamental characteristics inherent to democracy, such as the respect for the rule of law, that many of the other speakers talk about it, separation of powers, because in our countries, like my country, my own country, it's a pity to say, but they are not separation between powers. The decisions are taken not only in the presidential house, but by the presence of the president in the means of communication, and TV, radio, shows and says to the judiciary, you have to do that. You have to put in jail that person. It's what's happening this moment. The separation, I said, of powers, alternation in elected positions, fair elections, and the respect to fundamental rights and freedoms like freedom of expression and associations. The freedom of expression is a big issue now in most of our continent. Free press is in total risk. There are some laws that were approved by the majority of the congresspersons in our parliaments, and they put a lot of restriction to the freedom of expression. And I disagree with my colleague, Luis Alberto, about the role of NGOs. And I agree with the other persons that talk about the very important role of NGOs nowadays in the world, not only in Latin America. The importance of NGOs, that sometimes they are the only flags in continents, the only flags to say things are wrong and we are fighting for freedom of expression. In our countries like Ecuador, most of the political parties has been destroyed. Then NGOs are taking a leaders, and also some of the press. These so-called leaders of the socialism of the 21st century want to consolidate their model by rooting themselves in power through questioned constitutional reforms. Many will say they will elected by the popular votes. Yes, indeed. But let's ask ourselves, are elections the only fundamental characteristics that should define a democratic country? In Ecuador, last week, the parliament approved indefinite re-election. There is a lot of work that is yet to be done in Latin America in building solid democratic institutions. Until now, the winds of authoritarianism, of totalitarianism are blowing. What is happening currently in Venezuela is a clear demonstration that there is still a long way to go. As Francis Fukuyama says, institutions are only good as the policies they promote. Leadership matters a great deal. With good leadership, apparently dysfunctional institutions can be made to work well, while no set of rules will fully compensate for bad leadership. The pursuit of a model or models that reinforce the validity of democracy, but overall the happiness of the people and the fulfillment as human beings passes through the creation and construction of a philosophy that incorporates the aspirations of the majorities and minorities, that pursues equally without steamrolling the freedom, that consolidates a world of opportunities for everyone, and that moves forward in the principles of tolerance and respect of the others. The possibility of growing up, of developing, of forming families, of accessing to goods without overcoming others. This means that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that we will be celebrating tomorrow, as Ismael says, should still be the standard of, or the agreed way bill for the development of our countries. Latin America is still an asymmetrical continent with enormous fortunes in the hands of a few in one extreme, with several poor and excluded people in the other, what makes from time to time us to lament struggles and combats and to still have to show the scars of the underdevelopment that indicates that the major dilemmas and cancers of democracies keep being the exclusion and poverty and also the corruption, two cancers for democracy. All this has a background and intercalated with the country's actions worldwide, excluding models, the practice of intolerance, the advance of communications developed from the functioning of satellites for communications in outer space that mark the actual globalization with the generalized use of internet, of digital technologies, and of the famous social networks that can be tools but also weapons. In this sense, I propose, and it's necessary, to build a new global governance that avoids standardized or overpowering conceptions, but includes the local dimension of our identity that leads to the creation of not a global world, not a local world, but a glocal world that synthesizes the best of the globalization with its scientific and communication advances, but that does not refrain from understanding the local as the basis of what it constitutes the human dimension, maintaining the mutual respect in the core of the relationships among individuals, people, and nations. The world is calling for new paradigms, especially when tackling globalized concerns as climate change. The current meeting in Paris recognizes the importance of local partnerships, amplifying the spectrum of actors participating in this important event, trying to agree on pragmatic actions that will be implemented locally, but that will benefit the world as a whole. The conception of local makes us more human, blooming the advantages of diversity, just like with the plant or animal world, providing us a rich biodiversity, so valuable and necessary, but always under the limits of respect to one another, to the laws, to the principles of Pacific social harmony on the one hand, and to dogma and religious perceptions on the other, without letting religion to interfere in the government model, to be implanted and also letting us enjoy the attainments of the humanity as a whole, represented in the advances of science and technology, in the Creativity Summit that also frames windows of hope to the future. At the beginning, I talk about how diverse is Latin America. My small country, little bigger than Uruguay, but small at least, is an example of how biodiversity can work. We have the Andean region, the Pacific Ocean, the Galapagos Island, the Amazon jungle, and the diversity there probably is one of the richest of the world. Then maybe we can talk from the country that had the name of an imaginary line. Ecuador is because of the equatorial line that divides our country. Sometimes we say in Ecuador that as our name is Ecuador, an equatorial line is an imaginary line. We are not an imaginary country, but maybe we can provide some ideas to the local convergence of humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President, for the thoughts. Obviously, when you are at the helm, at the head of a country, you see things from a different perspective, and we have benefited from your experience and from your thoughts. Thank you very much. Now I turn to our third speaker, His Excellency Ambassador Jorge Alvarez Fuentes. He is a diplomat, university professor, director of the Diplomatic Academy. He is now ambassador of Mexico in Cairo after having represented his country in Lebanon, in the United Arab Emirates, and in Qatar. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me thank you for inviting me and to express with great sincerity how honored I feel to be sitting precisely with two elected presidents. I humbly address such a distinguished audience this afternoon. I think it's fair to say that the many Latin Americas that there is in one continent are radically different to what it was, and not that long ago. But time goes differently in different parts of the world. And if we think back, it's a little bit over 3 decades that democracy has come in a way to the various Latin America. Yes, today, the most common forms of government in Latin America are democratic. My country, Mexico, has gone also through some important changes throughout recent times. Today, there is still a long way to consolidate our democracies, but we have achieved along the way, even with lost decades, also better social protection policies and stronger and more integrated economies. Yes, millions of people have escaped poverty, and yes, the expansion of the middle class is very significant in Latin America. There is, of course, huge challenges. How do we, in the different parts of Latin America, keep on progressing and we make really that progress sustainable, particularly in a volatile and uncertain global, but also regional environment? We cannot forget, particularly coming from a country like mine, who hasn't had a coup d'etat, who has also had a one ruling party for 71 years, we cannot simply forget also some of the hardships that we've seen closer to home. Yes, I cannot forget that in 2009, in Honduras, there was a coup d'etat. We have seen some of those hardships. So in my view, there are unresolved issues center about the institutional arrangements. What are the institutions that have come about with democracy in Latin America? These issues or these problems around institutions affect the way governance is exercised, and of course the rule of law, given the fact that in Latin America there is a combination of democratic regimes, yes, and weaker democratic regimes. There was a well-known reference to Mexico some years ago from a very well-known and acclaimed writer, Mario Vargas Llosa, who talked about Mexico, the perfect dictatorship. Yes, because the challenges come along, particularly in regards to the huge proportion of our population that live under the poverty line, yes, and the very uneven economic distribution of wealth, the high levels of corruption, the highest homicide rate in the world. This is also part of what's been taking place in this recent decades in Latin America. Nowhere in the world, according to my own personal views, democracy has been shaped in such unusual and challenging of factors. Yes, there is deficit of democracy in Latin America. And as President Arteaga has pointed out, there are clear symptoms of fragility. There are main unresolved issues and those institutional problems that have to do with governance and the rule of law, particularly in the independence and interaction between powers. My country has lived throughout many, many years a presidential system. And it's only been in recent times that has changed. Of course, one thing that has to be pointed out is that more and more there's been a peaceful transfer of power in Latin America, and that is a very welcoming point. But there are serious constraints of freedom of expression, and I think it's fair to say that that is something that is present in all, if not in most, of the countries of the continent. There's also poor performance. There is low participation in elections, as has been said all along today's session. There's also the lack of gender equality, and there is what I will call citizen insecurity, which are undermining. So when I was invited and distinguished to come to this conference, I asked myself, how can in Latin America can we move from electoral democracy to a democracy of citizens and institutions? Democracy, as I was telling you, has big obstacles in Latin America. I've said poverty, income inequality, corruption, yes. So I think some of the lessons that, and some of the experiences that we've gone through are really relevant, and I would like at this stage to shift a little bit my attention to see if there are elements that could be particularly relevant to the Arab world. Are there in the transitions in Latin America relevant issues in those challenges from what we've seen in recent years in the Arab world? I think that notwithstanding the various striking differences, yes, there are similarities. I've been serving in Egypt for 2.5 years, and time and again, if not daily, I acknowledge the similarities in the case of Mexico and Egypt, as many of you in this distinguished audience know very well. Similarities and parallels. And those transitions that with various obstacles along the way have taken place in this past 3.5 decades do show also that there is a good way forward for changing and transforming the political, the economic, and the social realities that are the current landscape in the Arab world. I am convinced that the various transitions, and I'm not going to discuss individually, it'll be too much pretentious on my side, but of course the cases of Argentina that President Lacalle pointed out, but the case also of Peru and many others will no doubt be relevant to address some of the issues which are currently being debated in the Arab world. Latin America holds these experiences, but the pathways to justice, to freedom, to dignity ought to be seen far more closer. Very frequently I realize that in this part of the world, Latin America seems to be much more far. And yes, there is a great distance, but it's not the geographical distance which is the greatest. It is really the mental or intellectual distance that we sometimes see between Latin America and this part of the world. I think that one of the points that need to be highlighted is that the pathways, the various pathways that in Latin America we've seen in these past decades have been also a succession of reforms, which have taken sometimes forward and backwards. And that can be the case of Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Peru, and Mexico. I am part of a generation that benefit from those who fled Chile and Uruguay and Argentina. Some of my dearest friends are Argemex and Urumex and Chilemex. That means those young or not that young that came in the 70s and 80s fleeing from the military dictatorships. So the challenges remain still in an authoritarian rule to seek new ways to govern political life. In the case of Mexico, we went through a very gradual process of electoral reform process, from a one dominant political party with an opposition that remained constantly in the opposition, but almost never made it really into power, except for small local or municipal power. That took from the mid 70s until 2000. It was not until 2000 that the opposition make it into the executive, into the presidency. So I think we have to reiterate, at least coming from Latin America, we have to say it time and again, democratization can neither be imported or exported. It has to be a national, internally driven process that can benefit from also the comparative knowledge and understanding and those shared experience that individual countries have had over time. let me finalize with some of the specifics of Mexico's transition. It is a unique case. I think it's fair to say that, and that's the views that are very frequently acknowledged from our neighbors in Central America or the Caribbean or the Andean region or South America. Yes, Mexico's transition did not require a fundamental moment. We didn't change the Constitution. The Constitution of 1917 has been changed so many times around that that Constitution has contained all of the forms and all of the components, both Republican and Democrat ideals, and has been fairly adequate to guide the transition that we embarked in recent times. It has also been quite different to what took place in other parts of Latin America. Today, the people of Mexico are represented, but less and less, by political parties. The PRI that came into power just after 12 years of the opposition. Yes, but there's been splits in the party. The left-wing party, the PRD, came from the PRI. So it's been really a democratic process which has engaged, in a way, a country where the life in Mexico has truly changed. I was born, raised, educated until very late. The outcomes of the election in Mexico were foreseeable. The participation was almost a given. Why? Because we knew that once the candidate was chosen, it was going to be that man, the chosen one, the favorite one on the power of the outing president. So the long and slow-moving process that started in the mid-70s until 1997 came from within the political system. And that has been a virtue, but that has also shown some of its limitation. We do have a system of political parties that it's quite competitive, and we have an electoral system that we've come about, but it has come at a very high price. And I referred initially that there were points in particularly to the institutional arrangements. The institutional arrangements that came to be, particularly in the second half of the 90s, was to establish an independent, citizen-driven electoral authority. We are very proud of what the Electoral Institute has done over the years, but the story doesn't go always forward. There's been political electoral reforms introduced recently who have put that institution as an autonomous institution under a lot of strain. Now it's the National Electoral Institute that has to run elections all over the country, and at a very high cost, and I mean also financial cost. Democracy in Mexico has come with a big price tag. Now, we also did this in a way by which we were opening our economy. It's sometimes hard to believe that Mexico was a closed economy until the mid-80s. We opened the 80s, our economy, we joined GATT, and there was a process that we moved from, collapsing petroleum prices and rising international interest rates and the stories about Mexico's indebtedness, and we had a conversation in regards to the role of some very distinguished and very talented civil servants as José Ángel Gurría to sort out the way of our debt. Yes, how did we move really to a country that could actually embark in a series of transformations? In the 1990s, President Salinas embarked on a series of reforms. President Peña Nieto today has enacted long overdue overdue reforms. So, in conclusion, I think that from this part of the world, there has to be a growing interest in looking into Latin America, as it is taking time, and it has taken time throughout decades. I sincerely think that it's more than just taking a plane and having a look. I am tremendously excited that the organizers of this seminar had thought that the first session looking into a region was Latin America, and as I take time again, thank you very much for the opportunity of addressing you.
It is for us, Ambassador, to thank you for a very interesting presentation. Of course, the three presentations you heard, ladies and gentlemen, show some similarities between the situation in our part of the world and Latin America. Autocrats have been pushed out of power. There's been a more or less a beginning of a democratic process. But then there is a long way to go, for us at least. We have heard a very sobering and lucid presentations on the development in your country. But nevertheless, I have here, for instance, statistics who say that in the years between 2009 and 2015, you have had in Latin America 34 presidential elections. Of course, elections do not mean that you have the perfect diplomacy, but it is nevertheless significant. What I want to put to you, Madam and Excellencies, is that the years where you have had this transformation, democratic transformation, have been years, I think, of economic growth between 5 and 6%. Do you think that this developed economic growth has helped a transition to democracy? Even you have not reached perfect democracy, I realize that. But is the present situation where there is much less growth a danger for democracy? I allow myself to put this question, and then I will open the floor to the
I think that the populist regimes I was describing, I think that the first thing I said was that they needed money to give away. So I think that in Ecuador, in Venezuela, Argentina, and even in my country, which is not a populist government, but it's a leftist giveaway government, they squandered the benefits of the very good prices of the commodities. For instance, another country of Latin America, and a very serious one like Chile, with the high prices of copper, organized a fund and kept money for the rainy days. So they could be anti-cyclical, which is what you do if you get money. But then you have there one of the most serious and strong democracies in Chile. So, of course, the real populist way is to have money, give it away. With respect to the poor, they have a very special position. Being poor is not a normal state, it's a situation that must be eradicated, and to eradicate it, you can give help to people, but you must condition help, like in Brazil. President Lula, the Bolsa de Familia, was the giving of money for single mothers and minors and poor people, but with the condition of showing that the children were sent to school, were taken to the polyclinics for their medical exams, that ladies went for their gynecological exams. Of course, giving them something instead, especially skills and values through education, to make it possible to go away from poverty, which is not a state. But sometimes we feel that some of the governments want people stay poor because they are dependent, and they come in the elections in the help of this kind of governments.
I want to complement a little bit. Yes, commodities had very high prices. If we compare the price of oil, like $100 per barrel, when I was in a position, it was like $14. Now the government says that being with 35 or 40 is really a very bad price, but we compare with the others in the past, it is still a good price. Unless, with the difference with Chile and other countries, Ecuador doesn't keep money in a fund. The government spent all the money, and now we are getting some loans from China and other countries. Then we envision a bad situation for the next few years, especially next year. It is true, on the other hand, because it's good to be in an objective position to say that the Ecuadorian government invests a lot of money in infrastructure and also a lot of money in educational issues. Scholarship project that send young people to study in developed countries, it is a good project, and create some initiatives like Yacha initiative, that is the City of Science and Technology. That is a very good investment. Another good project is Ark of Noé, to make the inventory of all the biodiversity of my country. I think there are some good issues in the middle of the economical disaster that we envision for the next years.
In my country, which is not populist, we have, after all 10 years of prosperity, we have a bigger deficit and we have more debt.
I think that the question that Ambassador Sayed has raised also points out to what is the well-being and the state and quality of the democracy in Latin America. I think we ought to pay much closer attention to what are going to be the political impacts. If the commodity boom is over, particularly for certain countries, it's not the case of Mexico, but others, but it's certainly the case of Mexico, the lower prices of oil. What are going to be those impacts of those global and regional economic difficulties, particularly in some cases, already has been said. What is going to be the outcomes of these recent parliamentary elections in Venezuela, the changes that also President Arteaga pointed out that took place only a few days ago in Argentina? What's going to be really the outcomes? Will the reforms that my government has put in place come to fruition or not? What are going to be the outcomes also of the reestablishment of relations between Cuba and the US, the peace process in Colombia, or the way forward in Brazil? So this is taking place precisely in the middle of economic difficulties at the global stage. So yes, transitions do have, of course, limits and parameters that are going to be, no doubt, affected and impacted by economic outcomes.
Thank you very much. Now I turn to the floor, and we have another few minutes to any comments or questions on the topics. First one over there.
Good evening, Excellencies. Thank you, that lecture. Mr. President, you told us about separation of power. And Mr. Ambassador told us about similarity between Latin America and all Arabic area. I actually want to ask, is democracy starts with separation of power? You know, Latin America and all Arabic area and the faraway distance between them don't push me to read about Latin America history or something like that. But all what I can remember when I watched news, when I was a child, military coups in Latin America. I didn't know what about the state of military coups and what happened after all these military coups. Even I don't know about democracy state in Latin America, but I actually want to ask the similarity between what happened in Latin America and what's happening in Arabic areas these days. Is it starts with the separation of power? Democracy starts in both of Latin America or Arabic area with the separation of power. Is it the problem or the military coups are still happening all the times in all Arabic areas and Latin America in the past or now? Is this a problem? This is my question.
Okay, thank you. Who would like to answer these comments?
Well, I think Ambassador of Mexico made some points about the similarities between Arabic countries and Latin America. And if we think about what are the principal components of democracy, we see like freedom, like elections, like separation between powers, and other ingredients that Ismail Serajaldin put on the wall at the beginning. And of course, when we think about what's happening here and what's happening there in Latin America, we found some similarities. It is easier for governments to do things when you have a lot of money and to maintain people happy because you pay all the expenses, like subsidies, that they are not very healthy at the end of the days. You can invest money in education and health, of course. It's a big issue for the governments and for the people. But at the same time, if you are not planting good seeds about development, it's not going to have, we are not going to have very good results or a very good crop. We say that in our countries, particularly my country or others, like Venezuela or the Andean countries, we didn't save money for the bad moments when we had the good prices of commodities. And now we are going to suffer the circumstances. But on the other hand, we had a global world. And all what happens, if China buys less commodities, less oil or soybeans or whatever you can think, the economy, on the other hand, is decreasing. It's the same with climate change. When you see what happened, for example, I used to work a lot in the Amazon region, head of the General Secretary of the Amazon region, and all the eyes were to the Amazon saying, don't deforest, don't put the forest away. But at the same time, the climate change is affecting the forest. And if you put a lot of pressure because you want to have renewable energy, for example, with sugar cane, what happens in Brazil with sugar cane? All the, around Sao Paulo, that in the past were with cattle, because now Brazil is the biggest seller of meat, more than Argentina and Uruguay, that in the past were the bigger exporter of meat. Now all around Sao Paulo, that was with a lot of cattle, they moved the cattle to the Amazon and put around sugar cane. What happens? Is this the fault of the governments of Latin America, or it is the demand of goods from all over the world? It's the same. We can see the process. That was the reason that I was talking about local, because we have to think in a global world with global troubles, with global circumstances, with developing in science, technology, communications, all what means about the contact between people from different sides of the world. And on the other hand, you have the local with the needs, with the ambitions, eager to have good education, good health. Then it is, I think it's a very wisdom decision to put here in Alexandria Library a lot of people, or some people from different parts of the world with different visions, to talk about how we can deal with all these local issues now and in the future.
Yeah, I think you have stressed similarities and circumstances, and I will add that also our fight in both cases for democracy or attempt to democracy has been linked to the fight for independence and against colonialism in several cases. And this has given a same flavor of our fight. Any other remarks or questions? Did I see Dr. Sirajuddin wave for a comment? I didn't. Well, I think our time is out, and it's only left for me to thank you, all of you, presidents, ambassadors, and to thank the audience.